Not maintaining, just bear with me. So we'll go ahead and get started. So as far as the math is concerned, we're talking pretty easy stuff. We're not talking calculus or differential equations. Or
And
anything.
this is Commissioner Lober, by the way.
Hey guys.
Welcome.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and start rolling the presentation.
Okie dokie.
I hope.
Ta-da.
All right, so this is actually more about the district than it is about me. I just listed the cities and the unincorporated areas that are part of it. Kind of a cool change with this slide. This is the first presentation where I've actually updated Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Patrick Space Force Base. So for those of you that have to refer to it from time to time, get that nomenclature right. Next slide. Most importantly, this is my #1 canine constituent. You can guess whose little hound dog that is. He is hanging out at the house, guarding it at the moment. Next slide. So I had to put this in there just for a little fun. It's Friday. I know you guys probably have all had somewhat long or interesting weeks. I got this on Facebook a while back, but I saved it because I just thought it was so great. It's from a fellow who apparently cared for me at first. The first commission meeting I attended, Lober fired on some dude. I thought to myself, this guy's an asshole. As the meeting progressed, I found he's exactly the kind of person you want on the commission. Our short conversation during the break confirmed my conclusion. I really love that. So bottom line is I'm pretty blunt about most things. So if you ask me a question, don't take it the wrong way. I'll just tell you whatever my opinion is, good, bad, or indifferent. But at least, unlike some of these folks that are a little more perhaps spineless, I'll tell you how I see it. So if I know how I'm going to vote on something, if there's a vote coming up, ask me. I'll tell you. I don't hide the ball from anyone. You may like it, you may dislike it, but at least you'll know what you're getting. All right, so what I did with this is I tried to focus this particular presentation on how we as a commission and more specifically how District 2 handled some of the CARES Act funds. So let's go ahead if we could. So some numbers are rounded. I'm not going into 10 significant figures or significant digits. If there's a typo, I apologize. There really shouldn't be much in the way of typos. And if there are any, they weren't significant enough that I picked up on them reviewing the slides. Some of the program numbers based on participation where it says that they may need to be adjusted. I'll give you an example. We had a vaccination incentive for our first responders. We stopped that as of the middle of this past month when we started seeing that people stopped participating in the program so that we could take the remaining funds that were allocated to that initially and use them for other initiatives. We kind of got to a point where it looked like everyone that was going to get vaccinated as a result of the incentive has already done so. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. So last year we received 105.3 million from the CARES Act, the initial allocation of CARES Act funds from the feds. Yes, we received another 18 point something million in follow-up CARES Act funds, but those were specifically purpose designated essentially for housing assistance. So I did not include that funding in this presentation at all, but yes, it is something we received as well. Next slide. So there were 3 different types of requirements that generally had to be met in order for an allocation to be approved for funding under CARES Act. Next slide. And they're pretty common sense. The first thing is they had to be necessarily incurred as a result of COVID-19. Makes sense. That was the purpose of the funding after all. They could not have been budgeted in the most recently approved budget. There is an exception to that with respect to public safety and emergency management workers, that being the major exception. And then there was originally a 2020 date that they had to be incurred by, but it was extended to 2021. Next slide. So by extension, if it wasn't something that we incurred as a result of COVID, generally speaking, we couldn't fund it. So if someone was jobless and they were homeless prior to COVID having come on the scene, getting them housed, getting them fed, and getting them reemployed was not something we could use COVID funding for. It had to be as a result of COVID that the expenditures is incurred. So COVID, another way to look at it is if COVID was the but-for cause of what the expenditure is looking to address, it's probably good to go as far as that particular requirement is concerned. And if there is an issue where we don't meet or we've not met those requirements of satisfying those 3 particular criteria, it's ultimately all of us that pay into the millage that are on the hook for paying back the Treasury or the feds if we screw up. So it's important that we evaluate on a case-by-case basis each expenditure to make sure that we're not going to have to pay it back. Next slide. So prior to the November workshop that we had last year that was specifically geared toward addressing COVID funding, we had some initial allocations that already took place. Next slide. The allocation, importantly, didn't factor in any way up to that point whether the proposed recipient was a resident or a business within a municipality or an unincorporated Brevard like we're sitting in here in Merritt Island. Next slide. I'm not going to go through and spend too much time on this, but the bottom line is that these are the general types of programs that we approved before that November workshop that we had on COVID. So one of the things I'll just highlight though is on economic stability, fourth from the bottom, PPE kits for small businesses are on there. That was one I believe was unanimously supported by everyone that voted to approve that on the commission. I don't think anyone was in the minority. It was, I believe, a 5-0 on that. Next slide. This is just a breakdown of that prior slide's numbers in terms of a graph. So it shows you basically what the split was. And the important thing to keep in mind here, and if there are questions at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to go back to these two slides and discuss them in more detail. But the bottom line, and I think the important takeaway from this in the prior slide is that we didn't take a all horses in one cart or all apples in one cart sort of an approach. We really did try to spread it out so that we had a broader impact in what the funding was able to accomplish. Next slide.
What's the biggest wedge there?
The biggest wedge, if you look there, in terms of
Medical expenditure or
Yeah.
unobligate public safety.
the 43, if we go back to the prior slide, I can give you the exacts. So, oh, I'm sorry, no, next slide, I apologize.
The one forward.
Yeah, maybe in there.
Oh,
Yep, there it is. So unobligated public safety, a lot of that, what it went to, it ended up going toward replacing and constructing the new EOC. A lot of it went toward sheriff's office expenses in terms of COVID expenses that they incurred, reimbursing them. We, out of our roughly $1.5 billion annual budget, as far as the general budget that the county works with, about $125 million typically goes to the sheriff's office. So they are tremendously dependent on us for the vast majority of their expenses. There are other sources of funding for them. They do have a ton of grants that they're able to make use of and that they do make use of. But when they incur expenses, it's really incumbent on us to make sure that the check's clear for them.
You mentioned the EOC. Did that fall into the criteria you described earlier about the CARES Act funding?
Yes. Yes, we have an outside consultant, Tetra Tech, that's done a lot of work with us with respect to the Lagoon half-cent sales tax dollars. And we used the same consultant to evaluate it. They evaluated that and said that it was at low risk of clawback. The way that they did, they didn't say, the way they evaluated them, they wouldn't say there's no risk or there's a certainty it'll be clawed back. They gave us on the spectrum low, intermediate, or high risk. They classified that as a low risk. So, and as I mentioned before as well, or at least intimated, public safety expenses and emergency management expenses, there was an exception toward that initial criteria where even if they were budgeted, there's still an acceptable source or an acceptable source as far as being a potential recipient for CARES Act dollars. There was Treasury guidance that came out specifically on that point. And since the Treasury is the department that would be auditing us, when they say it's okay, if they audit us and have an issue at that point, we say, here's your guidance, we followed it to a T. So there was nothing that was ambiguous or open-ended about it. They were pretty clear that that would be that variety of expense, including emergency management and first responder payroll expenses, that those we could go ahead and reimburse ourselves for straight out of the CARES Act. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide if we could. Next one. So one of the things that we did during that November workshop that was geared toward just addressing COVID was we allocated a large percentage of that 43 and change million by adding new initiatives, by funding new programs, and eventually, as I mentioned, by reimbursing the sheriff a 7-digit number for his expenses and putting in a large 7-digit number into the new EOC construction. So next slide. So one of the things that came up in the process after each commissioner was able to argue for what they thought was a good expense was, and we'll get to this in a later slide, we had 25 million that we were essentially not able to come to a great consensus on how to allocate. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we get there, each commissioner had their priorities walking into the meeting. one of the things I advocated for was on the Health and Human Services side to increase the amount that we funded that particular department from 4.4 to 6.6 million, simply because we were at risk of running out of funding doing the programs that we were doing on the individual assistance side. So whether it was rental assistance, whether it was help with folks maintaining their residence and not having an issue where now they're homeless and now we have to put more money into homelessness, to keep them in their homes and try to keep them employed. Urgent care clinics, those were another item that I lobbied successfully for during that meeting to fund. A lot of them at the time were really hurt financially by COVID. I can tell you from having spoken with the owner of several of those clinics, or the owners of several of those clinics, people were generally fearful of going to an urgent care clinic or even an ER if they had a sprain or a strain or a burn or something that ordinarily they might go in for because they thought they were going to get the heebie-jeebies. So as a result, their business was down tremendously on the front end. It's improved substantially since last November, but on the front end, it was a problem for them, and they were not making what they needed to make. They were not able, in some cases, to meet their expenses in an ongoing fashion based on the fact that people were afraid to go in. Career Source was one that I pushed to have funded, and I'm happy I did. My goal with that was so as to avoid having to pay people their cost to exist in the form of helping them once they're unemployed, once they're out of a house. I'd much rather spend the same amount of money keeping them employed or getting them employed as opposed to just subsidizing their existence. If they're employed, they're helping out the businesses. If they're employed, they're producing something that's presumably valuable to society, and they're in all likelihood going to be in a more self-sustainable position than if we just let all hell break loose and then pick up the pieces in the end. So next slide, if you would. So this is what I was getting at in terms of the last 25 million. So we had a motion by the commission chair to delegate responsibility to allocate 5 million to each of the 5 commission districts. There were 2 conditions on that at the time: that it be determined to be at low risk of clawback by our outside consultant Tetra Tech, and that it had to be spent within the geographic boundaries of Brevard County. Slide. So that passed, albeit by a slim margin. So with respect to this, and I'm going to kind of fly through what the other commissioners did to focus mostly on D2 and to a lesser extent on D4. D3, so Commissioner Tobias, south end of the county, and D5, Commissioner Zonka, also relative to here at least south end of the county, asked that initially that their 5 million that they had authorization to allocate be used to reimburse eligible public safety payroll expenses. So this is again what we were talking about, which would free the money from those CARES Act restrictions. So by and large, it could be used for anything that the general fund would otherwise be entitled to be used for, which is generally speaking a pretty unrestricted fund as far as governmental funds go. It couldn't be used for kindling for firewood, but by and large, if there were any legitimate governmental purpose, after we've reimbursed ourselves, the money that's freed up can be used for any legitimate governmental purpose without having to go through a whole checklist of criteria. So in that sense, there was no immediate allocation as most people would take it to mean. It was basically saying we don't want to lose the opportunity to have these funds. We've identified that there is a way that we can reimburse ourselves for these particular expenses. And in so doing, we lose that originally December 2020 deadline, which was looming on us pretty quickly at the time this was dealt with, so that we have the opportunity to use the money as need be in the future. So next slide. So Commission Chair Pritchett asked that her 5 million go toward Parish Medical Center up in Titusville. Again, it's the only government-owned major hospital system in the county. And I do want to throw her a bone on that by pointing out, for the folks that are upset, I think what a lot of them fail to factor in is that Parish has taxation authority. And if they were to find themselves in a position where they're bordering on being insolvent or having terrible financial difficulties, their fallback, worst case, is to tax everyone that falls in their district. So in a sense, by allocating that money to them, it better prevented, or I should say it lessened the likelihood that Parish would be turning around and taxing folks because they're having a horrible year, or having a horrible year at the time. Let's go ahead and hit the next slide if we could. So D4, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this. $1.5 million went to Health First, 500,000 went to the Brevard Zoo, 500,000 went to USSSA, and then a small business grant expansion program that I'll talk a little bit more about was allocated up to $2.5 million by Commissioner Smith and D4. So basically Vieira in that area. Also includes Palm Shores and some other areas surrounding. Next slide. Mine's a little more complicated. And there is an update to this as well. I just couldn't fit it on the slide. I figured I'd kind of cut my losses with readability as it is. 1.8 million went into a small business expansion program that I'm going to get into in quite a bit more detail in just a moment. 900,000 went to countywide, so not just D2, but anywhere in the county, Brevard County Fire Rescue Hazard Pay. The bottom line is it wasn't that if you were a firefighter or a ocean lifeguard rescue employee that you automatically would get the funding. You had to be a first responder who responded to calls at the time that COVID was declared, when we had a local state of emergency declared as a result of COVID. So there had to be a risk of exposure to COVID. It's not just you work for BCFR, so therefore you get a check. We did not do it that way. And I was not in any way vague with anyone that asked about the plans or the implementation, so as to suggest that was even a possibility. So dispatch, for instance, they didn't get any of it. They asked, but that wasn't the purpose of the funding. So 500,000 I dedicated toward the EOC reconstruction. I thought it would be a good precedent and hopefully encourage our state legislators to look at funding us a little better. I don't know to what degree, if any, it had a part to play in their assisting us down the road, but they certainly did just a few months after. The county also allocated out of non-D2 specific funds quite a bit of money to the EOC. 460,000 was earmarked for first responder tuition reimbursement and training. So what that deals with by and large is you have folks that start out perhaps as fire medics or firefighter EMTs. In order for them to move up the ladder and to have an incentive to stay into the system, the finances at that time weren't there. We hadn't done a fire assessment, a meaningful fire assessment in some time. So in order for someone to progress up to a lieutenant, up to the higher ranking officer positions, they had to get an education. We don't have folks that are lieutenants, and we certainly don't have folks that rise to, let's say, district chief that don't have degrees, that don't have advanced training. So that's something that was put in place to keep those folks, to prevent them from increasing the already high attrition rate. Our attrition rate at the beginning of COVID within fire rescue was a double-digit number. It was far higher with that 0 to 10 or 0 to 5 year group of BCFR employees than it was elsewhere throughout the organization, throughout the county as a whole. So a lot of what was done with BCFR, people could say, well, it's great to help firefighters. That may be the case, but the more important goal to me than helping the firefighters was making sure that they weren't leaving in droves, because we're at a loss in terms of being able to replace them during a pandemic if they're all leaving, or a substantial percentage of them are leaving. So, although I'd love to say it was done for altruistic reasons, it was done to keep them here and to keep the system working as it's designed to work. So the vaccine incentive, it went out to all of our BCFR first responders. So EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, ocean rescue lifeguards, those folks. I also extended it based on funding having been available to the volunteer firefighters countywide. So even the Merritt Island volunteer, Canaveral volunteer, those municipalities with whom we share an auto aid agreement, and I'll tell you why that was done as well in a minute, which really is the bulk of the 16 municipalities we have in Brevard. I also extended it to their employees. So if there was a firefighter in, let's say, Melbourne with whom we share an auto aid agreement, or Palm Bay with whom we share an auto aid agreement, to respond to their calls with them responding to our calls, we would give them, well, not them, but their individual firefighters, their first responders, a financial incentive for getting the vaccine. The way that we structured it at the outset was each shot that you get, if it's a 2-dose series, because at the time this was approved, there was no Johnson & Johnson, it was just Pfizer and Moderna. You get $75 each time you get stuck with a needle. So up to $150 if you got both shots. Contemplating that we would potentially have a single dose availability for vaccine, we said when that comes about, if you do that instead, you'll just get a straight 100. So it was somewhat successful. I can get you guys the exact numbers when I get them. We just closed the program in the middle of this past month based on the numbers declining substantially. We had a huge spike, and then because the folks that were interested have already gone and gotten their shots based on that. So by terminating that a little bit earlier and not leaving it open potentially until we ran out of freed up the overage in terms of what was allocated versus what was used to be allocated to other expenses and initiatives. Indigent burial program, we set aside some funding as well, 160,000 for folks that don't have the financial means to bury their loved ones that die as a result of COVID. We had a little bit of an overage that we allowed if someone was a military veteran. We gave them a little bit of a bump in terms of what the county would be willing to pay toward those costs. I can tell you that what was set aside was not enough to have a luxurious palatial Egyptian pharaoh style funeral. It was enough to get someone basically in a pine box with a minimal ceremony in the ground. If they wanted to pay more than that, they certainly could eat the costs over and above what the county was willing to cover, but the idea was to provide a service for folks that otherwise simply wouldn't be able to have it. Independent pharmacy vaccine freezer, that was another one as well that I'm thankful we did. We did cap the cost on the vaccine freezers. Originally, there were some high requests from pharmacies. I went out, I actually spoke with Mark Hobbs here at Hobbs Pharmacy and said, what do these things really cost? He got me a quote that was substantially less than what a lot of other independent pharmacies were looking at. So we based it on that quote. And I believe the final number that we authorized was up to $2,000 per pharmacy to get these freezers. Now, understand this is not a 10-foot wide by 12-foot, tall freezer. This is a small freezer that's intended to store a couple handfuls of vaccine for a small mom and pop style pharmacy. The idea being that when vaccines are more readily available, as they are now, that they would already have the freezers in place, that Florida Shots, who they applied through, and that was a requirement they had to have already applied through Florida Shots by FDOH, so Florida Department of Health ran that program and runs it still, in order to request those shots. If they did that, we would reimburse them up to $2,000 for a vaccine freezer so that they could have additional locations throughout the county where folks could get vaccinated. Public defender plexiglass, basically a physical barrier. So if folks are sneezing on the employees that are there, it's going to be hitting lucite or acrylic instead of someone's nostrils and then giving them COVID or, for that matter, flu or anything else that's communicable by air. County staff tangible goods. I told the county staff as well, if you guys have expenses that you don't have availability in your budget to pay for that have anything whatsoever to do with COVID, anything whatsoever, if it's, let's say, for instance, a camera to do Zoom or Teams, or you need a laptop because you don't have a laptop to work remotely, let me know and I'll fund it out of the D2 block, even if you're not a D2 employee. We did leave at first a lot of it unallocated. Some of that has since been allocated, but I didn't want to spend absolutely everything in 2020, not knowing what 2021 would bring. I thought it would be prudent to leave something in reserve that was more than just some token amount in case we had some major expense that we had to incur this year. Next slide, if you would. So this is how that looks laid out in a nice 3D pie graph that, not publisher, but PowerPoint helped me out in creating. So you can see in terms of that D2 allocation, we really spread the money around all over the place rather than saying only get one thing. With this crowd, at least, is that the biggest single chunk of it, the 1.8 million, was for the small business program, the grant expansion. So I want to talk about that as well in a minute, but the next highest number was 900. So it was double the next highest in terms of the allocation within D2. So next slide, if you would. So nonprofit recipients, and there is an addendum I'll share with you all on this as well, because I did put some funding for nonprofits, 211 Brevard, Housing for Homeless, NVHS, Children's Hunger Project, Hummingbird Food Pantry, Ready for Life Brevard, which takes kids that age out of foster care and basically gets them stable housing and gets them in the employment in the workforce system, which helps all of us. Crosswinds, and then Family Promise. So together we're talking about with that, maybe a quarter or a third of $1 million, not a tremendous amount of money, but enough that it helped them with some projects that otherwise would not have been able to take place. Next slide. So the update on that is, again, based on how some of these programs have actually gone through and what's panned out with respect to applications and expenditures. I've been kind of taking a wait and see approach for doing other allocations just to make sure that we're not overcommitting the funds that we have. So I did get probably 2-3 weeks ago approval from the commission to allocate a number between 10 and 90,000 to county legal aid to help them with domestic violence cases. And their executive director indicated that year to year, the numbers are substantially higher as a result of COVID. Obvious reasons, at least that occurred to him and occur to me, are that people can't batter one another if they're not in the same room with one another. So when folks aren't working remotely and they're at home, you have more ability or opportunity for something to happen. And secondarily, as they say, distance makes the heart grow fonder. When you don't have that distance, the heart doesn't grow fonder. So it's, I mean, maybe it's kind of a bad way to phrase it, but the truth is people don't generally get on your nerves that otherwise might if you're not around them as much as you otherwise could be. So that's, I don't know a politically correct diplomatic way to say it, but there's a very clear tie with COVID having a jump in the, well, I should say a spike in the number of cases that they deal with. I don't want them to be in a situation where they can't help folks out that are in an abusive relationship on account of a virus that frankly, none of us had any part to play in causing. Next slide, if you would. I was gonna say, I hope that's not it. So I want to talk about the difference between D4 and D2 and how we allocated the money. If you give me the next one, please.
Mm-hmm.
So what a lot of folks asked me at the very outset, and I think the paper actually, to their credit, and I give folks credit due, even if I don't care for them generally, and the paper falls in that category, they helped clear up a little bit of the urban legend, if you will, about why things were different from district to district. I had a lot of folks that were upset that all of the other districts except 2 qualified for up to another 20,000 over and above the 10,000 initially received, but D2 could only qualify for another 5. And I want to highlight with that when you look at D1, D3, D4, and D5, the operative words there are up to. And with D2, there is no up to. Everyone that got a chunk of money past the first 10 got 5, period. So everyone got the full amount. Next slide, if you would. So the real answer is mathematically, we could not, so this kind of led to the first, if you're allergic to math slide, and get out of here, easy math. The math did not allow us to do the same amount per business in D2 as had been done or as was available to certain businesses outside of D2. Next one, if you would, Jen. So the longer answer that I'll show you the math for in a moment here is that we had a slew of additional businesses in D2, far beyond what any of the other districts had that received the full $10,000 from the county. None of the other districts had the numbers we had in terms of applications or by extension approvals. And we were in a situation where already had a much larger pot going into D2 for raw numbers, both actual amount awarded and number of awardees or recipients. Next slide. This is the problem. This graph represents the number of businesses which received that full initial $10,000 from the county before any expansion from D4 or D2 took place. You'll see D2, we had 364. Some of the others were 137, 139, well under half. And then we had a couple that were a little more reasonable, 197 and 187. We don't have the highest population in D2, but we by far had the highest number of business applicants and by far had the highest amount awarded out of that initial availability of grant funding. Next slide. So here's the math for the day, and I'll help you guys get through it. It's Friday morning. I haven't taken math since the 1900s, so I'm in the same boat that you guys probably are in with it. I'm going to keep it pretty simple. And these are the numbers from that slide as well. If you take the 139 from D1, the 137 from D3, the 197 from D4, and the 187 from D5, for the initial 10,000, every other district combined, there were 660 businesses which received that 10,000. D2 alone had 364. So given that we are 1/5 of the county, I think that suggests that there was something that ought to account for the discrepancy. For the fact that we had a lot more money coming into D2, going to a lot more businesses. Next slide. Before we get into the why, and I'll explain that in a moment, I want to talk real briefly about the overage here. So of the 660 non-D2 businesses, how many of those were considered for funding? Because folks talked about receiving up to 20,000 outside of D2. Only 104 of those 660 were even considered for funding. They had to go through steps to jump through hoops in order to be considered for that funding. They had to ask to be put on a list, they had to submit additional documentation, and they had to be vetted. So it's not really 660 versus 364 as far as the expansion is concerned, but rather 104 that were considered versus 364 who were considered, who all of whom received it. Oh, no, you know what, I do have one correction. I think we had one business that closed, so it may actually be 363. There was a business that closed after, so I probably should update the slide. I think that's off by one, but we're within 1/3% all the same. Next slide. So none of the 364 D2 businesses had to ask, none of them. They didn't have to submit any additional documentation. What we did in vetting them, we asked 3 questions. Is it located in District 2? So the geographic area that was on that first or second slide that you all saw. Did the business receive the first 10K? And in the case of those 364, yes, it did. And then the third question, and it applied as well with nonprofits or other 501c3s, does at least one owner or director in the case of a 501 reside in Brevard? If the answer was yes, they got 5, period. So they got their initial 10, they got another 5, so they're at 15, period. So over 340 of the 364 D2 businesses have been found to qualify. I think it was actually significantly higher than that in the end. I can get you the final number, but substantially everyone that got the 10,000 did in fact get the 5,000 additional. The vast majority of them had owners that resided in Brevard. The biggest reason someone didn't get it was because they didn't have ownership in Brevard. So if, let's say there's a gas station that's owned by a Clearwater corporation, they're not getting it. More money for the folks of us that have the residential and the business ties in the community. Next slide. A little more math. So how did we do in relation to other districts? If you look at the 364 that were fully funded at 10,000 apiece, you're a little over 3.6 million just for D2. The 660 at 10,000 apiece for all the other districts combined, they received about 6.5 million, 6.6 million total. So the average per other district, when you take that 6.6 million and figure it's spread out amongst 4 different districts, you're at 1.65 million average per district, and we're at 3.64 before any expansion. So we are, far and beyond better in terms of a grant standpoint to the businesses in D2. When you factor in additional funding as well, we're still in the same boat. We're still far ahead. 3.64 million, which is the number from the top from the initial allocation, plus the 1.8 that I had allocated as a follow-up expansion program, you're at 5.44 million just for D2 businesses. You take all of the other districts combined, there's 6.6 that we discussed, and you add the 2.5 that Commissioner Smith made available, you're talking about 9.1 million to all of the other districts combined. So if you look at that, our one district had almost 5.5 million versus just over 9 million for all the other 4 combined at the end of the day. So for the folks that thought that D2 was getting the short end of the stick, no, we didn't. We actually got the
Lion's share.
We got the lion's share. It was certainly the alpha predator, large cat share of the stick here. Next slide. So just a couple of other ways of looking at this. We talked about the average per district. We talked about additional funding here. So looking at the additional funding, when you add that up, the average for the other districts, just out of curiosity, if anyone's wondering, the 9.1 million, each other district, when you factor that additional funding in, received 2.275 million. So basically 2.25 million. When you factor in the additional funding for us, we received almost 5.5 million. So you're talking about, night and day difference in terms of what actually came to the ground to the businesses here. So as it says, D2 businesses ended up with well over double the average awarded to the other districts, any way you cut it, with or without the expansion program. Next slide. I want to tell you why that's the case, at least as far as I can tell. Everyone in my office, including me, during the time that this grant program was open, I had them calling, I had myself calling, visiting, and writing to D2 businesses, email. We didn't do as much physical mail, but we did some, encouraging them to apply, making them aware of the program, and helping them through the application process. That was the primary goal of the office when the program was open, making sure that everyone that qualified in D2 was aware of it, that they applied, and if they had a shortage with respect to having a deficiency in paperwork, that we babied them through and held their hand through to getting through the process. Myra's staff, and I see Larry, I'll give him a shout out there, Larry Lallo, their executive director, who I'm a big fan of, and who's down the hall from me on North Courtney. I asked Myra's staff to help us do the same within Myra's strategic area. So you're talking, generally speaking, 520, State Road 3, and the Barge Canal Corridor. They did that, which helped reduce our burden within Merritt Island so we could take the overage that they couldn't handle in Merritt Island, plus Rockledge, Cocoa, Cape Canaveral, Cocoa Beach, and the unincorporated areas, Avon by the Sea, Snug Harbor, and what have you. So we had a slew of people reaching out to businesses, making them aware of the program, advising them of what the deadlines were, helping them with any application deficiencies, and basically getting them through the program, whereas a lot of these folks would not have even known that it existed. So that's why we were in the position that we were in with respect to D2 having done so much better than any of the other districts. We had, in terms of man hours, a couple hundred man hours perhaps. I mean, we put in significant time to making sure people were aware. Next slide.
Had an awesome chamber in D2 pushing out
Yeah,
information.
and the chamber in D2 as well. I'll give you guys a shout out. You do deserve it. Thank you.
Thanks, I won't expect.
Jennifer had a big shout out. She was
Yeah.
pushing hard.
Especially, that's right, especially Jen.
Yeah.
So ARPA, sounds like a defense acronym almost. Sounds like DARPA a little bit, but not quite. So the American Rescue Plan Act funds. I know folks would ask if I didn't bring it up, and you can still ask if you'd like. 118 million we have coming into Brevard. 50% we have basically now, and 50% of that, so another 59 million coming in a future date. My initial proposal with respect to small businesses was to take 10 million out of that 59 and do another small business grant program. So we would say, forget the dates that we looked at as far as expenses for the first round that was done, forget the expansion. Let's set a new quantifiable set of criteria to have folks qualify for this. So for instance, and I'm flexible with how the commission wants to do this, how businesses want to do it. We could say, okay, from January 1st, 2021 through May 1st, 2021, whatever dates make the math work that are simple enough and easy enough for staff to be able to vet. Everything that qualifies, reimburse it up to a preset cap with that $10 million chunk that we have. We see how it goes. Essentially, first come, first serve with respect to who gets in. Because if folks now are wise to the fact that there's literally free money available or will be free money available, the early bird gets the worm. I don't think you're going to overload our systems. We don't have the problems that have been had with FDOH's vaccine registration. So I don't think we're going to have that level of issue. There are only so many businesses within Brevard. It's not that you have 660,000 people trying to apply to get shots. So that's kind of just a very, very general sort of a hint or an overview as to what my small business general idea comes to with respect to the ARPA funds. But again, there's flexibility. If someone wants to raise it a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that if they have a different way of administering it or a different range of dates that they think is appropriate. I'm not in stone with respect to that, but I think we need to do something meaningful, not with having in mind this being a continuing thing where if we get more money, we do more for the small businesses. But I think we still have folks that had a very hard time recovering in the beginning of this year. Now that we're in a better position with cruises on the very short list for coming back, I don't know that we're going to have to do this again, but I still think it's important not to let these small businesses fail and to give them a little bit to keep them afloat for what amounts to an absolutely unprecedented situation that's never happened in any of our lifetimes before, and God willing will never happen again, and statistically should not happen again in our lifetime. So, it's odd as someone that's generally very fiscally conservative to say, here, hand out money. But if the alternative is allowing a slew of businesses to go out as a result of a pandemic, I don't think we're doing anyone any favors by allowing that to happen. So I think, there's a little flexibility that's warranted, and perhaps deviating from what someone ordinarily might think is an appropriate use of government funds. The fact is that when the feds came up with these funds and when they came up with the CARES funds as well, it was done specifically because we have a pandemic. It wasn't done for grins. It wasn't done based on a magic 8-ball telling someone to do it. There was a very specific reason that the funding was made available. Not to say that we have a legal obligation to tie into their intent, but I think ethically and morally, to a degree, we have to make sure that a meaningful amount of the money that's sent down by the feds for the purpose of addressing COVID really does address COVID. So next slide, if you would. That's it. Questions? I'll call on you guys. If one of you doesn't maintain eye contact, especially if you're in the back, I start calling on you first.
And I stopped the screen share, so if you're on Zoom and you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please don't be shy. And I'm going to kick us off, Commissioner Lober.
Yeah, which guy?
And I'm sorry that Al's going to probably blow up my face for these poor people. But there was some concern when the commissioners were first allocated the 5 million. You said Tetra kind of said that that was low risk on the legalities of it all. And I know there was opinions going back and forth. Yep. Some of the calls that we got at the chamber were in District 2. If we take this $5,000 and there ends up being clawbacks, who's getting the clawback? The business or the county?
We're the one that's directly responsible.
The county. Okay. I just wanted to ask that question because it's one that I got quite a few times.
I'll tell you realistically, if we did have that clawed back, this is one of 5 commissioners speaking. I would need 2 more in order to agree with this. I think from a standpoint of equity, from a standpoint of fairness, given that the money went to businesses that really needed it, it didn't go to Microsoft, it didn't go to Google. I mean, it went to small local businesses that frankly were having trouble meeting payroll oftentimes or paying rent. If we have an issue where it's clawed back, which I think is exceptionally unlikely, but it's a theoretical possibility. I can't tell you that it's not at all possible. I would look to get it elsewhere within the county budget or even to have the county borrow it over a period of time rather than even attempting to claw it back from the businesses. Whether we have a right to or not, I would not think that that's the way to go. I think that's a very bad precedent to set, that we're going to give you a lifeline and then we're basically going to stab you in the back as you're reaching for the other hand to help you. That's not something that I would be inclined to do. The bottom line is we have taxation authority. If we absolutely have no other choice, it would come out of property taxes. I don't think it's going to have to come to that, but if it absolutely has to, that's sort of our fallback if we have any expenditure that we can't meet. So do I want to do that? No. Do I think that we're going to do that? No. But is that something that I would rather do than put out essentially the entire small business community? Yeah, I would do that first.
Right.
So no, I'm not going to ask individual businesses or support anyone asking individual businesses to return funding that we gave them in the form of COVID relief grants. I'm not going to do that.
Thank you. And not to hoard the conversation, but with this new 10 million, not new, but you know what I mean? The 10 million you're proposing, one of the biggest issues, our restaurants got super hard hit, hotels as well. We're big in the tourism hospitality community in this chamber, and we get those phone calls every single day. Right now, of course, the hot button issue is staffing. No one can find people that are wanting to work, even if they provide incentives over and above what unemployment's offering them until that runs out. Is there any thinking behind some of this new funding where it would be legal, quote unquote, to offer additional incentives for people to get back to work and help with the staffing issue out of that pot of money?
There's nothing in what you suggested that strikes me as potentially incompatible with what we have to do in allocating the funds. All of the guidance that comes from the Treasury, staff looks at, we look at as well. As long as we can check the boxes that we're obligated to check, if there is a way that it can be geared without de-checking or unselecting one of those boxes, great. What I'll tell you, there may be a cleaner or at least easier way to accomplish the same end goal, in that if we do this business grant process again, if the businesses want to use that money to increase what they're paying folks until the unemployment situation gets a little better, namely people aren't being paid to exist at home and being paid well to exist at home, by all means, just as we didn't tell the businesses what they had to do with the 10 or with the additional 5, you're the business owner, you're running the business. I'm not going to tell you how to run your business. I'm just going to try to help you have the ability to stay afloat long enough that you can have the first world problem of having those issues in terms of determining how you break apart the funding that you have. So I would suggest the cleaner part for me, or the cleaner way for me, is if the small business grant program goes through, let each business owner figure out how they want to incentivize folks. If they want to say, okay, well, we'll do, depending on the industry, we'll do an incentive for existing employees who refer someone else who applies and works a job and stays for at least a month, whatever the case may be. Right. Fine. If you want to raise the wages, fine. If you want to hire someone to do marketing, okay, whatever you guys think. I don't want to get in the weeds of telling you how to spend the money that is in all likelihood going to be allocated to you. That's the individual business owner's decision. But, you know, if you're asking me personally, do I think there's a perfect way to resolve the unemployment situation? At the local level, absolutely not. At the federal level and the state level, yes. Stop the incentives for people to stay away from work. I can tell you Cozy Corner is the closest restaurant to my office. I walk there, not usually in July or August, but certainly when it's nicer out, I walk there from my office. And I remember talking with one of their two owners about the fact that they were down to 2 cooks. And if they lost either of the 2 cooks, they have a problem, because they're both working, you know, between the 2 of them, that's it, 7 days a week. You've got 2 cooks, they're there all the time. If you lose one, forget COVID. If you get one that's got appendicitis, or one that gets the bad flu, anything like that, they're done. They can't make money. So, you know, there are a lot of businesses that have different needs. And I think the best person to make the decision as far as how to use the money that's available is the person that's running that business. I'm not in a position to say that there's any broad rule that would apply equally to each business, because I think that would be the wrong way to go about it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll shut up now. If you want to unmute or.
Hey, Jen.
Yes.
This is Joe Mayer. Bryan, good morning. Thank you for joining with us. Really appreciate it, and appreciate your remarks and your presentation. You know, it's really hard for us to believe that there is anything other than COVID. You know, there was life before COVID. Hopefully there'll be life after COVID. And when I think about that from a county perspective, we had issues like the restoration of the Indian River Lagoon. We had infrastructure issues and challenges with respect to roads, et cetera. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts in the outside of the COVID focus, as the challenges facing the county, and your thoughts in terms of going forward, new challenges, new opportunities. What are your thoughts in that regard? Thanks.
That's super open-ended. So as to avoid giving you an hour or 2 hour long answer, I'll just try to keep it somewhat concise here. The bottom line is my priorities in a general sense are what they've always been. Public safety, infrastructure, and to the degree that we have the ability to influence water quality. I can tell you that right now in District 2 in Merritt Island, we've got installation of a force main sewer line on East Crisafulli. I'm not necessarily thrilled with the entirety of the development that's running to at this point, but one of the things that I was happy I was able to achieve was the developer needed a certain size line. I talked to our utilities director, knowing that they were going to run this thing for literally miles, to negotiate with them to upsize the line so that rather than just serving the 100 or so units that they put in, if we want to in the near future, we can expand that to have other properties connect to that force main without having to bore, without having to trench, and without having to run an additional line. With us just paying the difference in cost between the line they intended to put in and a slightly larger line. So those are some of the things that aren't glamorous or sexy necessarily, that still are being done in order to ensure that we have what we need moving forward. I do think as well, and this is both an infrastructure and a water quality issue, that the county needs to, and we've done a good job of getting partway there, but we've not done everything that we need to yet. I need literally one more vote and I'll have the votes I need to get this accomplished, whether it's this year or otherwise. We need to focus more on the sewer infrastructure leading from businesses and homes to the actual treatment plants. So Sykes Creek, their treatment plant, it's a very good plant. It's not the cheapest plant to run because we use deep injection. It's not that we just release into the lagoon, thank God, but deep injection has maintenance costs. It's not a cheap process. In order for us to avoid having problems and leaks, our situation is not like perhaps other municipalities or other local governments. Our leaks, when they occur between the houses and the businesses and the treatment places, I should say the wastewater treatment facilities. If you take the treatment facilities out of the equation, because by and large, we don't have meaningful leaks that occur from them, you're left with the infrastructure, the 60-plus-year-old pipes that are in the ground throughout Merritt Island, the ancient lift stations that are older than most of the people walking around Earth today. And you don't need to be a PE, you don't need to be a scientist to figure out all of these are going to fail. They're time bombs, they're ticking now. We don't know how many more times they're going to tick. There needs to be a little more willingness to shift toward the infrastructure side of things, from the studying, from the more glamorous and sexy projects. I know kids may love super oysters and super clams, but when we have a lift station that's 60 years old that was due to be not renovated or retrofitted, but replaced many years ago, let's leave the capes off the clams now. They can do the Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne thing later. Let's go ahead and fix what we know is a time bomb waiting to explode. The 7 million gallons or so that we had come out of Titusville, frankly, if we used every penny of the soil tax needed to fix that, the lagoon would be in better shape than doing all of the other various projects that we're doing. When you fix infrastructure, it's not simply a one-time fix. You're fixing something where you get continuing returns over a period of years, the useful life of that infrastructure. If you dredge or demuck, wonderful. I'm not going to ever take away from that, but you're doing a one-time service by removing what's already there. Better yet, prevent the stuff from getting in there in the first place and decomposing and becoming the muck and the sediment, and you have less of that to do in the future. So I think it's important for the folks that are in politics not to take a political time frame view, a 4-year view or a 2-year view, and say, what do we really need to do in the long-term interest of the community, even if it doesn't help me get reelected, even if it's going to take 12 years or 18 years to fully materialize for there to be a visible benefit, rather than saying, okay, we can demuck and make this water pretty for a little while, knowing it's going to be just as bad again. So I think that's important. On the public safety side, I think we are in a very good place. BCSO, I think, is very well funded. Objectively, they're getting more than they've ever gotten. BCFR, we just did the fire assessment. I think they're in a much better place now, a sustainable place. I anticipate this month having some good news I can share with respect to Snug Harbor and substantially improving their insurance rating over their rating now, which is the lowest possible rating that you can get in the insurance industry for fire purposes. So those are kind of the general things that I will continue to focus on. Yes, they've always been going on even with COVID, but like anything else, when you have a fire that pops up, you've got to put the little fire out before you get to everything else. So it's been very detrimental toward a lot of the other concerns. I don't think just with my office, but with a lot of the offices. So the rest of it we've been kind of getting by with during the time we've had COVID. And now that we're in a much more manageable position, we're spending and we're able to spend a lot more time dealing with the other more routine issues.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Kelly. I know you have your hand up.
I was curious if you have, we just had the governor sign the record budget, and
Oh yeah.
so any thoughts on the budget and also the ongoing tension between the state and local municipalities and counties on home rule?
I'm going to be blunt, which is probably very dangerous. I'm sure this will get used in a political attack ad. I really don't care. I am generally a fan of our governor. I am not a fan of how he has interacted with local governments on a number of occasions. And I'll give you a couple examples. One that really does apply as well to businesses and home rule. First, if I go to one of your businesses and I wear this shirt and you say, "You bastard, you're wearing plaid," and it's a dark blue plaid, even worse. We don't allow anyone wearing dark blue plaid into our business. You can kick my butt right out of there. And if I refuse to leave, you can call BCSO and they'll take me out of there. But to say you can't mandate that I show you proof that I've been vaccinated, which to me has a far more legitimate purpose, right, wrong, or indifferent, than not liking the color or pattern on my shirt, I disagree with that tremendously. I think that is a horrible, horrible policy to put in place. I think it attacks home rule. I think it attacks, it is by definition a business regulation. It's not something that should come from above. In fact, I don't think it should even come from locals. I don't think it should come, period. As far as telling cruise lines that they can't ask for proof of vaccination, you're putting them, based upon what we saw over the recent past few weeks about the couple of minuscule options that are available to the cruise lines to resume cruising, you're putting them in a horrible position in an industry that is absolutely mission critical, certainly to District 2 and certainly to Brevard County, by tying their hands and saying, now there's only one potential path forward for you. You have to make it work. My position, and I say this taking my commissioner hat off of putting my attorney hat on for a minute, what I've told my clients, and it's not an absolute certainty that you can't get in trouble for this, but my level of risk tolerance and what I would do in my own business, my law practice, I have a mask requirement. If you want to meet me to discuss the practice of law, everyone has to wear a mask. If you don't want to wear a mask, that's fine, but you can show me proof that you've been vaccinated. I'm not refusing you service based on you're refusing to give me proof of vaccination. I'm refusing to provide you service based upon you're not following my mask policy. If you want me to waive my mask policy, I will consider doing so if you show me that. That's kind of workaround. I pulled the bill and I pulled the statute. I don't see anything that's flatly incompatible with having a position like that, but we shouldn't have to look for workarounds. It should never have been put in place in the first place. The other thing is when there are press conferences that are called that deal with issues of local importance that are also significant to the state, we get about as much notice as you do. And it's not just my office, it's county government altogether, and it's the city governments as well. We don't have advance notice, and if we do, we have minuscule advance notice to most of the things that occurred. Our legislative delegation is much better with respect to giving us notice. All of them are better. If they have something coming up, Randy Fine will call me, or Tyler will call me, or Tom Wright will call me. Not an issue, no problem at all. Any of them I could work with. Tallahassee, we work with, I get the impression that they work with us because there's no choice and because local governments exist. There is very much an impression that I derive from how they operate that we are an impediment in their minds and their views to their overarching statewide goals. So it's unfortunate that it exists the way that it exists. I'll tell you, Rick Scott's a great one to deal with on the federal side. I talked to Rick Scott about Rolling Thunder. You know how hard it was to reach him? 5 seconds, texting his cell. I don't have DeSantis' cell. I can get a hold of a federal senator in seconds. I can't get a hold of DeSantis in seconds. And realistically, it ought to be the other way around. So, I like a lot of his positions, but in terms of impinging on home rule, in terms of business regulations, I'm not a fan.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So, and I'll share, thank you for your comments in the chat. I will share those with the commissioner, but whether you're on Zoom or in person, we have time for one more and then we'll start wrapping up.
What do you think created the biggest disparity between you and D4 in terms of your budget allocation of $5 million?
Different philosophies.
Okay. And what would you say that is?
I think his philosophy was more of a laser approach and mine was more of a widespread approach. I tried to look at not putting all of my eggs in one basket. And if you put it in the right basket, everything works out great, wonderful. But my thought is just as life doesn't operate on or off, there's a dimmer switch oftentimes. Rather than saying, okay, we're putting everything into this one category, I felt a lot more comfortable saying, okay, these are the various needs throughout the community. I can impact a number of facets of life in the community to a moderate degree as opposed to one or two facets in a tremendous degree. Morale within BCFR was an important issue for me. We had not gotten to the point where it was clear we would have a fire assessment. With the attrition that we had even during COVID, especially during COVID, I did not want to find that we would lose a tremendous percentage of our workforce because they simply didn't think we cared about them and that there was no future potential for an improvement in their wages or their benefits or their treatment. So part of what dictated or directed or drove me toward supporting BCFR to the degree that I did was to try to bridge the gap between them leaving then and getting to a point where we had a fire assessment on the table that's sustainable for a period of 7+ years. So that's the the short version of what the difference was. But I think he and I both did in fact want to have the bulk of it or the single largest chunk go toward the business community. But I think it was just a difference in terms of how laser focused it ought to have been.
Thank you. And I apologize, we did stuff backwards, but you can see how much great information was shared today. We wanted to jump right into it. I'm sorry I didn't give everyone a chance to introduce yourselves, but welcome to Government Affairs. Glad you were here this morning, no matter how you joined us. And I'm going to kick it over to our chair, Ashley Wood, who's going to close us out.
Thank you, Commissioner Lober.
My
It was a
pleasure.
great update. I just wanted to mention that the budget was signed this week. There was some vetoes on it. I believe there's only one thing from Brevard County for FIT that was vetoed. So the EOC has their money in there, along with some other great things for the county. And then next month, we have no meeting. It's our summer break. And then in August, I believe we're gonna be doing a home rule actual meeting. So that will be interesting to kind of give an update on what home rule is. We hear about it a lot. So it's kind of like a big overview of all of that, which I think will be very informational for everyone. So with that, I think we are done. I don't think there was any other announcements.
That's it. We'll hang out for a few minutes after. So if anyone has any questions, I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you for joining us and have a great Friday.
Thank you.
If you haven't and you don't